Um, so it's my pleasure now to welcome our opening panel, which is on multi-stakeholder, strengthening multi-stakeholder AI governance. I'll introduce the panelists and welcome you up to the stage, and we'll hand microphones to people, so please come up as I call your name. John Palfrey is the president of the MacArthur Foundation and previously served in, among other roles, as the executive director of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, which is one of the founding members of the Global Network Initiative. Nicole Foster is director of AWS Global AI and Canada Public Policy at Amazon. Alex Reeve-Givens is the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, another GNI founding member. Thomas Schneider is the ambassador and director of international affairs at Switzerland's Federal Office of Communications, Ofcom. And Malavika Jayaram is the executive director of the Digital Asia Hub. Oh, I'm so sorry, Margaret, I missed you. My apologies. Margaret Nayombura Ngundu is the former cabinet secretary of the Kenyan Ministry of Information and Communications and Digital Economy and an independent academic member of GNI. Welcome, Margaret. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. So let me start by just giving a brief introduction to the Global Network Initiative, which is itself an 18-year-old experiment in multi-stakeholder governance. At GNI, we bring together academics, civil society, investors, and tech companies to work together to advance freedom of expression and privacy. We've grown our network over the years to become more global and to respond to shifts in the tech landscape. And I want to just highlight one of our more recent reports, which examines the role of government interventions in AI through a human rights lens. For this panel, I hope we'll tease out some of the different perspectives on what the words multi-stakeholder AI governance mean, both individually and in combination, so that we can engage in a conversation that hopefully will continue throughout the rest of today as well as the rest of this week. Thomas, I know you have a lot of thoughts about multi-stakeholderism, so let me start with you. In your experience working on internet governance, as well as the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on AI, how have you seen multi-stakeholderism work in practice, and how do you think AI governance can benefit from multi-stakeholder participation?
Normally it's technicians that do the honor. So, yeah, hello, good morning everyone. Well, first of all, as somebody coming from a country with direct democracy where people can and should, not always do, vote on many things many times a year, I have to tell you that inclusive governance processes are painful and cumbersome. Because you need to talk and listen to everyone. This takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. You cannot just make a deal with the chosen few and then have a quick deal, quick result. You need to offer something to everyone and convince many people. And if you want to get a result that makes sense, you also need to empower all these people that have a say and make sure that they understand and find common ground with all. So why bother and take all this pain and efforts? Why take more time and cumbersome processes if things could be done much simpler, much faster? This is a question that we hear from many, many people. My experience is very simple, because it's worth it for many reasons. The more perspectives you involve in a process, the more everyone understands the issue and all issues and also the stakes of the people involved or the people affected. This raises awareness, helps everyone to better understand the issues at stake and the consequences of the decisions on the stakeholders. It also raises transparency and usually, not always, but many times provides a better basis for so-called evidence-based policy making. It creates also an incentive for all stakeholders to behave and remain reasonable, to seek compromises that are acceptable to almost all stakeholders. And this normally leads to a more balanced and nuanced result, again, better quality of governance. And another important point is it creates a shared ownership over the decision. It responsibilizes all stakeholders to stick and defend the decision. And this in turn makes implementation of a decision much easier, because people accept the decision as the best compromise solution. They are less inclined to find ways around the solution, which makes the solution more stable and sustainable, and there's less need to police people or institutions or actors, and allows for a more lightweight implementation mechanism. So the higher investment in the setting of the rules through inclusive mechanisms pays off many times by a better solution and easier implementation. This is our experience that Swiss people usually have, no matter which stakeholder group they belong to, and this is also what we're trying to bring as experience, of course, in the international debate. But something, and this is my second point, which is important and should not be ignored, is that stakeholders are aware of the fact that at different stages of a discussion or a decision, the roles of the stakeholders and the responsibilities vary often. So the involvement and the function of the stakeholder also is linked to the expected outcome of a process or a decision. And to give you the example of the Council of Europe process, when we were negotiating the convention, we spent 3 years before deciding on whether we actually go for a convention or not. We spent 3 years discussing in a multi-stakeholder environment, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, what are the existing instruments worth, where are the gaps, and what may be instruments that may actually help us solve the problem. So we spent 3 years on this, and in this period, of course, the experts from academia, civil society, businesses, and others that have more knowledge on the substance than the government representatives in the end negotiating were crucial for the beginning, the basis of the analysis. But then, of course, in the second phase, where you negotiate a legally binding treaty, then the roles change, because you have government representatives that are supposed to, in the end, sell the result to the parliament, make it accepted. In our case, even the population can say yes or no to what we negotiated, which means that we are bound to some extent by the ones that we are accountable to. And which civil society, business people, and others are not in such a process. So also as the chair of this, I was obliged to respect these different roles, and not everybody was happy that governments played the role that they had to play. We were criticized many times for not treating the other stakeholders as equals, but in this part of the process, you cannot treat them equal, because some are responsible for negotiating a treaty while others are not. And this is, I think, something that is important to know. If you negotiate a soft law instrument or develop a business code of conduct, then of course the roles are different. I think this is something that we should keep in mind. And finally, my third point is that no matter what the outcome is or what the process is, and that also goes for government regulation, which only produces good results if you can hold your government accountable for its decision. This also goes for multi-stakeholder processes, that you need to hold these accountable. And that means you need to have transparency, you need to have inclusivity, in the sense that also minorities that do not have the resources or have less resources have not only their voices heard, but also are being listened to, and their issues being taken into account. And this is why we were very happy 2 years ago when in Sao Paulo we developed the Sao Paulo Multistakeholder Guidelines, because they offer a very important and good tool to also help multi-stakeholder processes to be transparent, to be accountable, and also to give enough resources to vulnerable groups that may not be heard. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. I think those 3 points are critical. Investing up front to ease implementation later, the importance of recognizing different roles of different stakeholders, and the centrality of accountability. I'm really glad you mentioned the Net Mundial principles, which were developed in the context of internet governance, but I think apply incredibly well to AI governance. So I hope that's something that we will be able to carry through this summit. I know the Brazilian government, which was very invested in that event, and stakeholders who participated across the original Net Mundial process and then the 10-year review with the Sao Paulo principles. We'll be highlighting that throughout the week. Alex, CDT has been doing incredible work looking through the high-profile, sort of multilateral AI governance conversations and into some of the less transparent, less newsworthy spaces where AI governance is happening, standards development, assessment, and review processes. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're finding as you understand who's playing at those tables, what roles they're taking on, and the extent to which multi-stakeholderism is apparent in those spaces?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much to you and to CCG for hosting this. Having this be an official event related to the summit and have this focus on multi-stakeholderism is so important. For those of you who don't know the Center for Democracy and Technology, we're a civil society organization that fights to make sure that emerging technologies protect people's rights and advance democracy. And we do that by advocating directly to governments for effective regulation and working directly with companies to make sure that they are adopting policies and practices that respect and advance people's rights. And I think through that lens, one of the most important things to focus on is what multi-stakeholderism does and what it doesn't do. So I will start by saying that it's not a substitute for regulation, which is needed for people to be able to get remedy and redress. But it plays an essential role in those spaces where regulation either still needs to develop or is too specific that you need additional multi-stakeholder processes to help enforce the goals of a regulation, or where we're seeking harmonization across jurisdictions, where different governments may land in different places, but globally we want to have improvement in particular areas, and multi-stakeholder commitments, principles, guides can help get us there. Here, in those spaces, civil society, industry, and government together can help establish important norms that shape company behavior. And as Ambassador Schneider was just saying, done right, multi-stakeholderism can be an incredibly important tool for accountability. The reason is, even as governments change, the civil society members who were at the table will remember what the commitments were. They will help check whether those commitments are being followed, and they will continue to advocate to ensure that the public interest is being served. And so that balance of how to use this very specific tool in the toolkit, we actually need to make sure how we're ensuring that it's effective. I'll touch on kind of 4 areas in the AI, just to get us very grounded in the AI governance space, since that's why we are all here this week. 4 areas where I'm seeing some robust conversation and use of multi-stakeholderism that I think are important for consideration. One is in the space of documentation and transparency. AI is developing so very quickly. A big question now is around adoption. What are best practices? What do people know before they use and deploy a tool? And everybody is being asked for documentation. Every country is thinking about transparency. And we're going to have 50 different regimes that aren't useful for the companies and aren't useful for researchers or people who are trying to adopt and buy these products. So here there's been important work happening in the international standards bodies like the ISO. The OECD released last year at the Paris AI Action Summit a set of reporting principles that essentially asked companies about their best practices for AI governance, but in a very detailed formula so that you can look at how different companies are answering the same questions using the same rubric so that it is easier to make comparisons and assess progress over time. There are other bodies like the Partnership on AI that has been advancing best practices and documentation, and my organization and others participate in these spaces because it's actually useful here for the companies to know from the researchers, from the public interest organizations, and from government regulators, what information are we trying to learn? What makes a disclosure useful? So that's one area where there's some work happening, more progress to be done. A second is in the space of benchmarking and evaluations. I have been finding recently as an advocate, it is one thing to go and talk to a company and say you need to do such and such better. It is another if there is a benchmark and evaluation against which they can be assessed. This is one of the currencies that is really important right now because companies are trying to figure out how they match up against others, how they match up over themselves over time, and people want these benchmarks and evaluations to be able to make informed choices about the tools and the products that they're using in different settings. Again, it doesn't work for one company to develop a benchmark by themselves. It doesn't work for a group of companies to develop it without civil society at the table as well, making sure that that benchmark is well crafted and effective and then being implemented and evaluated correctly. A third, one of the important themes of this summit, as the Vice Chancellor teed up so nicely, is in multilingual AI, one of the most important efforts that is really underway this year in particular, and I hope we'll continue to see progress moving forward. Companies around the globe know that their systems need to work in the many different languages around the globe. But again, it's not efficient and it doesn't work for companies just to be doing this in a vacuum. Number one, because of the resource challenges, but also for a lot of underrepresented languages and underinvested languages, there is a huge trust gap where you feel like a company is going to be exploiting and extractive rather than working in collaboration with your community to capture your language so that the tools are working well and with cultural competency. So my organization, we hosted a partnership workshop with CCG just yesterday, actually, with the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law on what this looks like to not only improve capabilities, but also cultural competency and trust and safety and guardrails to make sure that they are working in every language as well. Again, everybody needs a seat at the table for that conversation for it truly to be effective. The fourth area I'll touch on is near and dear to GNI's heart. It's why it was founded, is in the space of human rights. And here there is hugely important work to be done for accountability to ensure that when tools are being developed and used, they do so with human rights at the core. When GNI was founded 18 years ago, the vision behind it, and I'm allowed to say this because CDT was involved in its founding as John in his former role, was that when governments are asking technology companies for information about their users, or when they are trying to shape the information that their users and their citizens can access from those tools, they can exert enormous pressure over those companies that can go against human rights principles. And that it doesn't work for a company to stand alone in pushing back on that request. It is much stronger when those norms and expectations of how you handle those requests have been developed by a multi-stakeholder process with numerous companies and civil society squarely at the table to make sure that human rights can be protected, that we can speak with unanimity in supporting those human rights principles. That is equally true in the space of AI. These tools are going to give more people exposure because of the huge amount of private information that we share with these tools, their enormous surveillance capabilities. The privacy stakes, the human rights stakes are higher than ever. So are the content and free expression stakes. Will a chatbot answer questions about a particular topic? How does it do so? Is the government shaping what people can learn from these tools? And if so, how do we ensure there is transparency? There can be differences across regions. Different governments will come out differently on this, but how do we make sure there's transparency and visibility into how those levers are being pushed and what those norms are? And again, a multi-stakeholder process can help make sure that people are speaking with human rights at the center and agreeing across companies and with civil society that transparency is key so that users and citizens understand what's happening. So that's another important place. The last thing I'll end on is what makes multi-stakeholderism work and when does it not? And Charlotte, you said this so beautifully. You said we have to move from consultation to participation. It doesn't work for just a phone a friend, have a quick brief phone call with civil society, or maybe invite us to the press release event, and then move on with the day, right? What we want is civil society have an equal seat at the table because we can be useful for all of the reasons that I just spelled out in those earlier examples and that the ambassador spelled out so well as well. You want buy-in from all of the legs of the stool, civil society, companies, and government together. Civil society can also show up with expertise for public accountability, and we have the memory to help ensure that those commitments have staying power over time. So I think one of the goals that I think really matters here is how do you ensure that civil society has that seat at the table, and not only has the seat, but meaningfully participates in it. And I will tell you that it is in the company's interest for civil society to be there alongside you. For the governments, it is in your interest to serve your citizens, for civil society to be there at the table alongside you. And so at a time when we are seeing a slide to multilateralism, where a lot of heads of states just want to talk to the CEOs of companies and then go on with their day, that third leg of the stool, whose job it is to represent the public interest and fight for the users and the constituents who are impacted by this technology, need to have an equal share and show up to help make sure that this work endures.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks so much, Alex. Those are critical points. Three legs of a stool, three body problem. Like, we can't do this bilaterally. Civil society has an incredibly important role to play. John, MacArthur Foundation has been supporting a lot of that work. You've been quite active on AI, including identifying AI opportunity as a priority for investments, helping to seed Humanity AI, a 5-year, $500 million commitment. Tell us why you're making these bets and how you hope that they will play out.
Jason, thank you for the opportunity to be with everyone here at the AI Action Summit, and congratulations on this being an official session, a big deal at this moment in history. And let me back up and thank the Vice Chancellor for opening remarks, which were spot on, a fellow legal scholar, and of course someone who's been leading the way here in India along with CCG. And Shalak, congratulations on all the work at CCG, and we're honored to be sponsors of this event and sponsors both of CCG and GNI in this work broadly. It is a hard draw to follow Alex Givens and Ambassador Schneider on this topic. Yes, I did have to do it. But the good news is I can incorporate by reference. That's something lawyers say, which is to say you agree with all that's been said before, which means you can use fewer words after that at a summit. But let me back up also to say a little about the MacArthur Foundation in order to answer your question, Jason, as to the why we have chosen this area to invest quite so much in terms of our assets. MacArthur Foundation, for those who don't know it, is based in Chicago in the United States, and our remit is to make the world more just, verdant, and peaceful. And we have offices in other parts of the world, in particular in Nigeria and here in India. So we've had an office here in Delhi now going on 31 years, and an amazing team who are based here and have done work according to our commitment to a localization pledge. So we work with our team on the ground to figure out where and how to invest in each place that we operate. And it just turns out that this is an area of great interest, both to our team here in India as well as our team in Nigeria and our team in the United States. And why is that so? Well, of course, it affects all of humanity, and it's also an area in which MacArthur has had a long-standing funding role. In fact, you were describing the beginnings of GNI. Of course, MacArthur was a long-running early funder of GNI, of Berkman when I was there, of CDT, of Malavika's work as well. So this is an area in which we've had a long interest, and I'd like to credit Eric Sears, the Director of Technology and Public Interest at MacArthur, in the front row. Many of you know who has really created, I think, I don't want to say best in class because that's unfair, but a wonderful portfolio of grantees. So this doesn't come from nowhere that we make these big bets. But for all the reasons that the Ambassador has noted, that Alex has noted, we think this is a moment of opportunity, a window, in which it's possible to shape AI for the better and for humanity. And I think we can all make the case for the challenges associated with AI. We can all point to the difficulties that we face as societies and the risks, and we need to deal with those. We need to erect the appropriate guardrails and safeguards and set the protocols and so forth. But on the flip side, our hope as a philanthropy in the service of humankind is to make this an opportunity, and that's why we framed our emerging work as AI opportunity, is really to say, what are the ways in which you could situate for a young person here in India or in Nigeria or in the United States or anywhere around the world, the opportunities that may come from this, if in fact we center people rather than center, say, the technology and the speed of processing or wherever it might be, or an economy in a broad sense. What if we actually transform the way we think about this and said, an 18-year-old is in front of us, how can they have a brighter future for this, not a less bright future? And we all know the mental health challenges, the ways in which there seem to be fewer jobs in certain areas. What if you flip that and said, there's real opportunity for humans if we put humans at the center of this equation? And I believe that the promise of the AI Action Summit being set here in the Global South, in the global majority, offers that promise. And so I think that's a big part of what we're seeking to do. So in terms of funding, which when you're a funder in the room, you realize you have a dollar sign or a euro sign or rupee sign on your back, at least while you have this role. So what are we doing? How are we giving away the money? We're doing it principally through two mechanisms. One is called Current AI. Many of you who were with me and us at the Paris Action Summit last year know that it was announced, which is a global effort of hundreds of millions of euros to support a range of things, including linguistic diversity has been a big focus that Alex was just talking about. And so we are a participant and a donor to that fund, which is in turn giving out money around the world. And we launched what we call a cousin to current AI, which is called Humanity AI. And that joins 10 funders from the American philanthropic space who have committed together $500 million United States dollars over 5 years to, again, center humanity, to create opportunity for young people. And if that effort is successful, Humanity AI and current AI, it will have accomplished at least two things in my view. One, which is very much a MacArthur-y thing. So if you're in the US, you may know that MacArthur is most famous for our MacArthur Fellowships, or MacArthur Genius Grants, they're so-called. And the idea of those grants is to find individuals who have really creative ideas and to give them 5 years of support, absolutely no restriction whatsoever, and let them put those ideas out in the world. And so we continue to think that a great way to fund in this space is just to find the Alexes and Malavikas and others who just have the most brilliant ideas and support them with unrestricted money, and to see creativity bloom. And I think this is exactly what the speakers already have said, which is the voices at the table need to be more than just the companies who have such market power, the governments who have such power in regulatory terms. It needs to have individuals and creative people who are going to change the world. And that can be done by scholars or civil society actors or others. So unleashing creativity is one. And then second is exactly the point that Alex made, which is around voice and a seat at the table. It's not just to be invited to the event, not just to be able to be present as things are happening, but really to have a meaningful voice in the process. And I think that's something that philanthropy can accomplish. We can't fund everybody. We realize that we have to say no more than we say yes. But when we say yes, what we're trying to do is support a relatively small number of people who can represent a much broader perspective and a much broader set of ideas and a broader number of people. And I think that's one of the ways, and we can ensure that it's not a very small number of Silicon Valley-based individuals writing the entire story here, but rather actually have a much broader remit. So that's why a Chicago-based organization where the money was made in the US, why do we operate in Nigeria? Why do we operate in India? Why do we give away money globally? It's because we actually believe that the ideas are going to come from a much broader area, and that's going to make for a much stronger future for everybody. And frankly, for the opportunity, for an 18-year-old in Chicago is going to be better because of ideas that are going to come from everywhere and the voice that civil society has. And to conclude is really just to recall the beginning of GNI, Jason, and Alex said it perfectly, which was, the original moment that I think of was there were a series of companies, and that included Yahoo back then, but also Facebook, as it was then called, and Microsoft and Google, and they realized they couldn't figure out how to go about preserving free speech, privacy rights, and others in a complex, increasingly global environment without the support of the civil society sector, without academia. They came to host their first secret meetings at the Berkman Center. Why? Antitrust laws meant they couldn't do it otherwise. They needed the insights, they needed the representation from others. It was actually necessary, I think, to do that. And so GNI exists to solve a crucial problem that still exists 18 years later. And in fact, I think the stakes are even higher. So I would urge us all to think about how do we flip and focus on the opportunities that can be unlocked if we get this broader approach to stakeholder governance right. And I think we have many lessons we can learn from 25, 30 years of internet governance through the life cycle of GNI, where we can have a broader group of people, not just a very small number of people who benefit from AI as it develops. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. So Nicole, we've heard a lot about the role of tech companies. Tech companies obviously play an incredibly important role on AI, both through your own efforts to conduct business in a responsible manner, but also as an active player in the formation and development of laws, in multilateral discussions, multi-stakeholder processes. I wonder if you could give us some insight into how AWS and Amazon approach AI governance, both internally as well as in their external engagements.
Well, I'm so humbled right now to be on this panel. And this is a truly remarkable and inspiring group of people. So I feel a little bit like this could be cold water, so I apologize. But I think the first thing I would say is when AWS comes to the table to talk about what the kind of regulatory or governance landscape might be or should be, we're not just speaking on behalf of AWS. We also come you don't actually get to see what they can do until they're then in the hands of customers that do really amazing things for their stakeholders. And so when we come to the table, we also come with the experience of understanding how those different organizations in every geography and in every sector are implementing AI and how they're doing it. So when we come to the table, we definitely are coming with them sometimes in mind, but actually sometimes physically with customers to come and talk about their use cases. I think that frameworks can be extremely useful, but it is also extremely, I mean, just hearing you both talk about the complexity from a stakeholder management aspect, the actual implementation of a framework is also extremely complex when you're trying to design something that can apply in so many different circumstances and with different nuances. And so coming up with concepts that can apply to complex financial services implementations or deployments, or healthcare, where the types of issues you're trying to manage or risks you're trying to mitigate are so different, it's a very significant challenge for policymakers and even for us in terms of trying to also come up with concepts and ideas. So when we think about the regulation or governance, it's really important that you're able to be use case specific and nuance specific to what's going on in that sector or what the data is that you're working with or how people are going to be engaging with it. The other thing we think about also is that it's risk-based, that we're not regulating everything to the same extent, that we're really focused on the right use cases that have that degree of complexity. And then the other thing we think a lot about is where the right responsibilities should lie. Now, Amazon is a developer and a deployer, so we're never off the hook. So it's not that we're trying to push responsibilities away from us. We absolutely hold all parts of the whole chain at different stages, but really understanding at what point people have the right control over those systems in order to think about the right governance measures. And so the other thing that we think about, though, is just the incredible potential of this technology to have a positive impact for people, but an incredible impact for the economy. And so how do we also think about these governance systems in a way that doesn't necessarily cost so much that then you lose the ROI on actually deploying the technology? And so some of the data that we are looking at data in a number of different jurisdictions. Canada, I think, is about 30% of the cost is on regulatory aspects. We don't even have an AI law in Canada yet. In Europe, it's about 40% of the cost of deploying is just on compliance. So the cost of compliance is becoming very significant, and I think when we're thinking about the economic benefit, we don't want to be in a situation where we're completely losing the upside because of the cost of the implementation. The other thing that I think is extremely important, and Alex mentioned this, is standards and the importance of international standards. The more that we can have different regulatory regimes or legislative regimes reference international standards is going to be extremely helpful for a number of reasons. One is an economic reason. So if you are a company in Nairobi that is looking to build something that you potentially might be able to scale globally, you want to be able to build that to the same standard, and then you can then sort of deploy that in other contexts. So there's an economic reason for that, but there's also actually just a benefit in terms of and we see this in a lot of different contexts, but if an organization is really just focused on checking compliance boxes, they are not necessarily making the right decisions from a responsible AI deployment perspective, because you're just doing the things you have to do, as opposed to thinking about, well, how do I actually deploy this use case in a responsible way? We see it in cybersecurity as well, where the compliance overtakes the actual security aspects of the job. So I think the more that we can agree on, and I think international standards are an incredible opportunity for us to have that harmonization or agreement on the right sort of controls, is going to be super useful for organizations. The other thing about that is technical feasibility is something that is difficult than you may realize, because an engineer needs to understand, they don't speak human rights language, they don't speak ethical language, they speak a coding language. And so how do you translate these concepts into code is actually very, very challenging. So as long as, I think we also have to appreciate a science-based approach to answering some of these concepts and an engineering-based approach, and making sure that what this panel very inspiringly wants us to achieve is technically feasible as well. And technical standards, I think, are, people that work on technical standards is truly a vocation. You wouldn't think about it that way, but the people that do that work really, they are so thoughtful and precise about how to actually take these concepts and make them something that everybody can then implement. And so having that technical feasibility and leveraging those international standards is a really strong opportunity, and I have become a standards champion. So I just encourage policymakers to really think about how we can leverage that work, because I think it could have a huge impact.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicole. And definitely want to echo both what you and Alex were saying about the critical importance of standards. That's something we've seen in the internet governance world. And I want to shout out the work that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been doing to try and bridge that gap between standard setting processes and civil society expertise. It's hard work, but when it happens, it's magical, right? When we can get, engineers may not speak human rights language, and human rights advocates may not code always, but the concepts at their base are familiar to both. And I think there is a sort of shared commitment across product developers and the teams that work on standards and human rights advocates. And so finding ways to bring people together in those processes is critical. Malavika, I'd like to turn to you next. You've practiced technology law for over 2 decades, working across India, across Asia, through Digital Asia Hub and other organizations that you've been a part of. Given that range of experiences, I'm curious how you see the Impact Summit this week fitting into the broader picture of AI governance, and what do you hope will come out of it?
Thank you. It really struck me yesterday at the other event that we had, how people were navigating how they feel about the summit, whether to engage, whether to boycott it, sit it out, engage from a distance, be really happy they weren't invited to the main event, doing the whole Groucho Marx, I don't want to be part of any club that wants me. So it was really fascinating, that sort of spectrum of engaging and sitting it out. And I like telling stories, so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. So one of the things that this summit reminded me of in terms of moments was, I don't know if many of you in this room might remember, but in the year 2000, the biennial International AIDS Conference came to Africa for the first time. And this was about 4 years after the combination drugs had been proved to be effective in treating AIDS. And a lot of the people on the African continent who went, which is where 23 million people had the disease in Africa, a handful had it in America where all the drugs were. And Dr. Peter Mugenyi from Uganda made this very, very powerful comment, which if you've seen the movie Fire in the Blood, which talks about this whole struggle with this amazing tagline, medicine, monopoly, malice. So I'm trying not to come up with a similar tagline for this summit, but one of the things that came up when Dr. Peter Mugenyi was talking about how he was fighting for these drugs to be available at an affordable price in Africa, he said, this conference shows up on the African continent for the first time. All of the activists, the doctors, the healthcare people, all of us go to this conference. We hear about people talking about the drugs and how they're $15,000 a year to treat like a handful of people, and then we go back home to our communities to watch our people die without treatment. And he made this really on-the-nose provocative statement saying, where are the drugs? Where the disease is not. Where's the disease? Where the drugs are not. And I was thinking of this in the context of the AI Summit, in terms of, we're talking a big game about inclusion, participation, what it means to be included. And it really struck me, when you're talking about the proliferation and the rollout of AI technologies and services in the global south, is the data where the users are not? Are the services where the use cases are not? Is the control where citizens are not? So I found this a very helpful framing in thinking about what inclusion and genuine participation actually means. And I also find the sort of global south framing a little troubling, because I'm all about framing and metaphors and language, because I think words matter. I mean, I am a lawyer, but I think even as activists and civil society people, we're very careful about framing. And I think a lot of people have been saying the global south framing needs to be retired. And I keep reminding myself, the global south is a position, it's not a place. And whatever you might think about whether there are better framings about global majority or any other kind of language, you have to remember that the global south is a framing imposed on the global south by people wanting to make us legible to themselves. It's not a game we gave ourselves, right? It's something that was imposed, and it does sort of implicate a lot of troubling and contested ideas around. It's not about who speaks, but also who decides. You get a seat at the table, you fill the seat, you keep it warm, and then you go home and your notes are not recorded in the minutes, and you didn't help the decision making, right? Or somebody reframes what you said because they were white and male and they got heard, and you said the same thing 5 minutes ago and nobody heard you, right? So I think these things really, really matter. But I think one thing that is common, like whatever your preference for which term makes sense to you, it is a shared exclusion from decision making, right? I think that is one thing that is in common, and if that is the goal of this summit, to somehow, in whatever chaotic, dysfunctional way, to sort of unite these disparate voices, and I think there is value in that disunity. Like, we are not a homogeneous global south. We contain multitudes, and to think that we, represent one position or one tone or one approach, we're being really silly when we think that. And I think we have to remember that if you are being oversimplistic and reductive in what you expect to achieve out of this summit, you're going to get exactly what you asked for. So I think we need to dream really big. Another thing I was thinking of in terms of the summit was many, many, many years ago, and I think one of the reasons why India sort of positioned itself as being well placed to do this summit is we've done Aadhaar, we've done identity, we've solved identity, right? On the back of all this sort of techno-utopian wet dream that we're sort of now saying we're in a good position to be the person representing AI interests. I remembered many years ago we had the first civil society and multi-stakeholder consultation for the Aadhaar project. It was a very tokenist effort, one disability rights activist, one free software person, one healthcare person, one lawyer. But it was fascinating because Nandan Nilekani was in the room, and he was very friendly and nice and super interested in everyone's critiques in the morning. By the afternoon, he was sort of flagging and, like, I have a project to run, can we wrap this up? Really not interested with the critiques. And actually sort of demonizing the critiques and the people critiquing as just get on this progress bus already. Like, we're solving something big, don't be the friction, clogging up this machine. And Shankar Singh, who is one of my heroes, who was one of the co-founders of the MKSS, which was instrumental in bringing about the Right to Information Act in India, he was moderating the panel in this very avuncular way. He puts an arm around Nandan and he says, when I started working on environmental impact and dams, I said you can't create dams in places until you've displaced the villagers, found them alternate homes, and people thought I was nuts. Along comes the activist Medha Patkar, who says no dams. And he says, suddenly I found, overnight I became a moderate without having changed my position, just because someone more radical came along. And I think my invitation to people at the summit who think civil society is some kind of friction to be optimized away, and that our voices are useful to have in the room but not necessarily instrumental in outcomes, I would sort of urge that we're the people who are now saying no dams. Tomorrow we're going to be the ones that you want to engage with and talk with because someone will come along saying no AI. We're asking for safety, inclusion, blah, 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 impact assessment, none of which are problematic. And tomorrow you will want to dialogue with us and take our concerns on board because other people will come along saying, we just don't want AI at all. We want to be excluded and that is our right. So I think in terms of engagement and dialogue, to listen to the craziest, most out there radical ideas in the room is the sanest thing you can do. And to not see us as a problem that you don't want to listen to, but to see us as incredibly valuable in this process at arriving at some kind of consensus, whatever that looks like, however messy, however imperfect, because as all lawyers think, like, due process matters. The process is as important as the outcome, and to be seen, to be visible, to be heard is incredibly, incredibly important. So we don't want this to be a situation where the drugs are where the disease isn't. And I think we also need to remind ourselves that we're always told, let's end on a positive note. Tell us something nice about AI. I don't think we should. There are enough people saying amazingly nice, friendly, hippie things about AI. If we live with our rage and anger, good things will come out of it. And that's where I live most of the time, in a very dark place. But I think it is only through rage and anger, rage at whatever kind of machine you think you want to attack. We're not being Luddites, we're not being crazies, we're not anti-progress, we're not anti-development. But the kind of development, the kind of progress really matters. This summit has 3 tracks around people, planet, and progress. I find it baffling how you think progress is a separate track, separate from people and planet. I just don't get it. But my hope is that when this summit, maybe this summit will be the Durban moment in the AIDS crisis, where things did become affordable, where things did get democratized, where everybody had access. That's my hope for the summit.
Thank you. Thank you, Balvika. Those were wonderful remarks, and that's a high bar. But I hope we can achieve it. Margaret, I want to turn to you now. You've had a distinguished career working in public and development sectors on technology issues, including being deeply involved with developing Kenya's national digital master plans, as well as the African continent internet governance strategy. More recently, working on the WSIS plus 20 process, supporting the African Union there. And I want to understand from those experiences what lessons we should learn about how to ensure global majority, global south, whatever we want to call the countries, the people, the spaces that are being excluded. How can we more meaningfully include them in these types of processes?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to GNI for this invitation. I'd like to drawing from these experiences at the national policy design, continental norm setting, and the global negotiation, I would like to frame my thinking around 3 questions. When has multi-stakeholder participation shaped outcomes? When has it been symbolic or fallen short? And what that implies to the AI governance if Global South perspectives were to matter in practice rather than rhetoric. When you look at when multi-stakeholder participation has worked in several national and regional processes, multi-stakeholder approach have worked best when participation has anchored to real policy formulation, decision-making, authority, and policy implementation, not when it comes to, as the end, treated as an added. So when we look at the case of national processes, when you're coming up with strategies, when you're coming up with frameworks, stakeholders where they have been engaged before decisions have been made, when we are setting up the agenda, when we are coming up with the problem definition, then that time it works. When participation was problem-driven, not abstract, when we are inviting the civil society, the private sector, and the technical communities, we tie their input to the outcome we are coming up with. It could be like digital public infrastructure, we get the expert on that, and they provide that contribution. It could be data governance, it could be the skills or platform regulations. government actors have to take clear ownership of the process, and in that, then they are able to incorporate what they get from the other stakeholders. So in these cases, multi-stakeholder participation functioned as a policy intelligence mechanism, not merely a legitimate exercise. Non-state actors shaped visions and priorities, things like inclusion, affordability, interoperability, and not just coming at the tail end of implementation. When it comes at the continental level, intergovernmental organizations, they set frameworks, they set guidelines, they come up with strategies. So again, at this point, multi-stakeholderism works best as an instrument for largely normative and coordinative work. And particularly non-state actors were able to influence how problems were framed. I can give the case of African Union Child Online and Empowerment Policy, where instead of focusing on protections or risk mitigation, we focused on empowerment. So again, that comes from that approach. They're also able to bridge technical right-based and development perspectives that governments or intergovernmental organizations alone might not be able to fully integrate. At the IGF ecosystem, again, the multi-stakeholderism has worked very well at the national, regional, and continental perspective. And in this, multi-stakeholderism influences norms and discourse. It embeds development-centric concepts, access, affordability, linguistic diversity. Again, all these terms, we come up with them because of this kind of engagement. And then we know at the IGF sector, priorities are determined and discussed in varied lenses while aligned with the global theme. So again, where has multi-stakeholderism participation fallen short, or it has been symbolic? So despite these successes, there are persistent structural weaknesses. Often stakeholders' participation is limited in early stages of policy development. So again, once you are involved at that point, then whatever changes are made, you don't get to know about it. And again, where there is participation without power. In some cases, multi-stakeholder processes can be consultative, but not consequential. Input is gathered after strategic decisions have been made, so it's more like a rubber stamping exercise. These are weak feedback loops. Again, at the end of it, you are not able to tell where your input was incorporated or whether it was incorporated at all. And where there's a broad participation but narrow agenda control. Usually with a small set of actors, you can sometimes find the government, the donors, external partners, they're the ones that are taking control and making the decision. So this produces a pattern of procedural inclusion, but substantive exclusion, leading to stakeholder fatigue and cynicism, particularly among civil society or the small and medium enterprises where time is constrained. You don't have all the luxury of time to go and give input, and you cannot see the output. Also, it fails where there are structural asymmetrics within multi-stakeholder space. That is across both national and regional settings. Multi-stakeholder participation has also struggled to overcome deep structural inequalities, where there's capacity asymmetries, and I think it has been mentioned earlier. You'll find sometimes government lack technical expertise. You'll find probably sometimes the civil society are not well funded. So basically, where there's that kind of asymmetries, dependency dynamics. In some cases, some stakeholders exercise disappropriate influence over agendas, and I think you have seen this based on the contributions on what roles each is playing. We also have an equal continuity in engagement. Participation favored actors who could engage consistently over long policy cycles, something many global South stakeholders cannot do without dedicated funding. So multi-stakeholders in this context, combined with limited capacity, risk reproducing global inequalities rather than correcting them. So what are some of the lessons from maybe the YCs plus 20 and other global processes? And from this, we learned that inclusive regional processes do not automatically translate to influence in global negotiation spaces. Global multi-stakeholder processes do not automatically aggregate national or regional multi-stakeholder outcomes. And we see that even when African positions were developed through inclusive regional consultations, negotiations still prevailed actors with permanent missions, legal expertise, and long institutional memories. We also have developing priorities, including those which are very critical for the continent, Connectivity gaps, public sector, transformation, data sovereignty, among others, were often treated as secondary to global predefined governance narratives. We also see that multi-stakeholder inputs were filtered through state-centric, geographically constrained negotiation formats. So again, it didn't matter how much there was consultation at the national, regional level. When we go to the global level, then power dynamics plays. So this gap between inclusive preparation and exclusive negotiation spaces is a critical failure point. The result is a gap between participatory legitimacy and negotiation power. Worth noting is that in the past, the IGF space, there has not been a binding decision or enforcement mechanism. Going forward, I believe that will change. So what are the implications for the global AI governance? These experiences offer clear lessons for global AI governance that multi-stakeholderism must move upstream. We are talking about inclusiveness, consultative. We should be able to do that from the beginning, agenda setting, defining the problems, what risks matters to who and when, not just implementation. So everybody needs to be at the table and discussing this. The risks being prioritized, are they developmental, are economical, are they social, are they institutional? Again, we need to be all there. Again, regional processes must be treated as a first order input. For the case of African Union positions, national AI strategies and regional digital frameworks should feed directly to the global AI governance instruments, and they must be referenced, operationalized, and reflected in institutional design. This requires moving beyond treating regional perspectives as stakeholder views and recognizing them as sources of normative authority. And the third point is that capacity is a prerequisite for meaningful multi-stakeholderism, that for effective participation depends on sustained investment in technical, legal, and economic AI expertise within governments, independent research institutions, and civil society in the global south, and south-south coordination platforms that persist beyond single negotiation cycles. And without this, participation remains episodic and reactive, limiting the impact of stakeholders and reducing their roles to responding to rather shaping agendas. So in conclusion, multi-stakeholder participation is effective only when it redistributes agenda setting power and not when it merely broadens consultation. For global AI governance to meaningfully incorporate global south perspective, it must be willing to accept plural development pathways. There is no single universal model for development or sustainability. It must allow regulatory diversity, and we must treat development imperatives as equal with safety and innovation. And that is holistic approach where society benefits, environmental sustainability, and safety are embedded into the innovation process from the outset. Otherwise, multi-stakeholderism risks becoming a legitimizing ritual than a governance mechanism. Global South voices will be present, but not decisive. I think Maravika has stated this very clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. I had high expectations for this panel, but you have exceeded them. So the pressure now falls on the rest of you as we transition from this panel to the rest of the conversation today. Thomas, you started us off by pointing out how inclusivity is painful. And I think we then heard throughout the panel as to why that painful process is so important, how that ends up allowing the conversation to focus on the key issues, ensuring that the process itself is legitimate, ensuring that outcomes and implementation will be sustainable and meaningful. So I really want to thank all of the panelists for helping to ground these principles and concepts for us here. And I would like you to join me in giving them one last round of applause. Thank you.